welcome back to my channel. So last year, at the end of the year, I did a little recap sort of on my reading challenge. And I believe the way that I did it last year was I did a video on sort of the top fiction books that I read and another video on the top nonfiction books I read. And I thought that this year, what I would do is kind of talk a little bit about my reading stats. I don't know if it's something I've ever really talked about before. I think if you have been around my channel for any length of time, you probably know that I like to read. I always have a reading tracker in my bullet journal. I honestly have been tracking my reading for a really long time. In terms of bullet journal level tracking, obviously I've only done that since about 2016, but I have had a Goodreads account for many years. I think maybe since 2008. I would have to check on the app, but I've had an account for a really long time, and I've used various methods where, you know, I used to just keep a running document. I used to use a system set up in Evernote. Like, I have tracked my reading on and off for a while, and for a really long time I was never super careful about tracking, just because I was like, oh, I like to read, like, it doesn't really matter. But the older I get, the more I really appreciate having some kind of a record to what I've read, because I also will use it to go back through, like, I love to reread books. And so I'll use it to go back through and see, you know, I can track on Goodreads how many times I reread a book, which it's not actually very accurate, just because I've only started tracking how many times I reread a book in the past couple of years. And there are certain books that I reread every couple of years, and I have done for like over 10 years. Like, you know, I don't have all the data, but I am getting a little bit better about it. You know, each year that I've done the Goodreads challenge, I've gotten better and better about actually tracking in all of the things that I've read. And so I would say that this year, I think out of, you know, the last couple of years, this year is definitely the year that I did just really dedicated tracking. And even in my collection bullet journal, which I have here so I can refer to it, I got better about actually tracking certain bits of data that I can't find in my Goodreads. So I thought I would kind of go through and give you guys a breakdown of this year and maybe talk about a few books that really stood out. So let's get started. So my reading challenge for this year, as it has been for the past couple of years, was 50 books. Now, I looked kind of back through, I think the first year that I did a Goodreads challenge, I started it halfway through the year in 2016. And so I set it for 32 books. I definitely passed that. I don't remember exactly how many I got. And then I had only 1 year out of the past 5 years. I only had 1 year that I didn't hit my Goodreads challenge, because it was the 1 year that I said I wanted to read 80 books, and I only read 72. But the years on either side, I read 80. So yeah, whatever. It's fine. I'm a little bit miffed about that one, but it's okay. So that is kind of my average. My average is between 70 and 80 books a year, and I do read a variety of types of books. So this year's challenge was 50 books, and I read 83. I wanted to read 5 books in French, and I ended up reading 14, which I will say that at least half, if not slightly more than half of those, were manga or graphic novels in French. So they do go faster for me, if you will, but I did also read a number of either just fiction. Actually, all I read in French is fiction, basically. I read a lot of like fiction literature, that kind of stuff. Some thrillers or like mystery books, a lot of Agatha Christie when I first started, but less so now. Now I've kind of geared a little bit more towards literature. It just sort of depends what I get my hands on during the year. So I would say it's kind of split, manga in French and like fiction in French. I also wanted to read 2 books in Spanish, and I ended up reading 7, which is really good for me. And the majority of those were graphic novels in Spanish. A friend of mine lent me all of the ones, I believe all of the volumes that she had from La Volatile, who is an Argentinian artist who lives in Spain, and I ate up all her books. I freaking love them. So I think that was probably like 4 or 5 of the 7 were her books. I also wanted to read 1 book in Italian, and while I read a story with my Italian teacher, I did not actually finish the entire book. It is a series of short stories by Agatha Christie, which is living right over here. And as I mentioned, I read 1 story with my Italian teacher, and that was it. It is once again on my list for this year. I think reading a book in Italian has been on my challenge for the past 2 or 3 years, and I have not yet done it. So honestly, I already read in French and in Spanish, and it takes hours and hours of practice to really get comfortable reading in a foreign language. And I've already done it twice and I'm just kind of being lazy about it. Like, that's really all there is to it. So that was kind of the overall stats. But one of the other things that I do track is I actually have started tracking if the book that I read was an audiobook. So if I don't do my little audiobook symbol next to it, then it could be either an ebook or a physical book, and I don't really make a distinction between those just because I live overseas, and so it's easier for me to use my Kindle to read books in English, and then typically books in a foreign language, and some books in English, but typically books in a foreign language I will actually read in like paper copy. But the vast majority of the books that I read, not listen to in English, are going to be ebooks that I got from a US library, basically. And so that I don't really like make a distinction between if it's a real book or an ebook. However, I have started marking how many audiobooks I listen to because audiobooks are a fairly new thing for me. I think I started listening to audiobooks maybe 2 years ago. Actually, let's see if I wrote it down. Oh, wow. So I have been listening to audiobooks for longer than I thought. I actually started listening to audiobooks like maybe halfway through 2017, but I've really ramped up my listening in the past like 2 years or so. So it actually took me a while to start doing audiobooks because I was old school and I was like, no, I really like having the book. And moving overseas has forced me to be a little bit less old school in that I don't have the funds or the access to paperback books in English in the quantity that I need for how much I actually read. So I did have to eventually use a Kindle, and I do read physical books when I can, but I do also use my Kindle. It doesn't bother me at all, like it's fine. But audiobooks were one that I was like, oh, I don't know, like I read pretty fast on my own and I like tend to get distracted and I just don't listen to what's going on or whatever. And I finally started listening to them, and I first started listening to audiobooks, specifically like cozy mysteries sort of thing. So I picked 2 or 3 series that I was like, I'm just going to listen to these series as audiobooks and we'll see how it goes. And honestly, I fell in love. Like I just dove headfirst because, especially now that I sew, there are certain things like when I'm assembling patterns or when I'm quilting or, you know, any sort of activity that I do related to sewing that doesn't actually require me to like really pay attention, anything I can kind of do on autopilot. A lot of times I listen to podcasts every once in a while, but mostly I listen to audiobooks because if I have something on like the TV, for example, I have to kind of look up and pay attention to that, or I just kind of miss everything. But with an audiobook, everything's in my head already. Like I don't have to look up. I can just focus on exactly what I'm doing with my hands, and my brain is occupied by this audiobook. And so my audiobook consumption has skyrocketed in the past like 2 years, basically since I started sewing. So for this year, out of the 83 books that I read, 35 of them were audiobooks. So for those of us who are better at math than me, that's slightly more than a third of the books that I read, I think. Yeah, that sounds about right. For a long time, I really kept to kind of like mysteries and that kind of stuff, but I have been branching more into some like nonfiction books in audiobook format and like branching into different types of fiction in audiobook format. And honestly, I'm obsessed. Audiobooks are my new favorite thing to do while I'm crafting. Well, I can't even say it's my new favorite thing. I've been doing it for like 2 or 3 years and apparently had just like forgotten that it had been that long. I also went through and I wanted to count because I do, you know, when Goodreads wraps up the challenge and all of that, they don't necessarily go through this information. Like they tell me what the shortest number of pages and the longest number of pages that I read and like this, that, and the other. And I'm like, I don't really care about that. Like, it doesn't really fuss me how many pages I've read or whatever. But I was like, I am interested in knowing how many manga or graphic novels I read and also how many nonfiction books I read, because I definitely am much more of a fiction reader. That is the majority of what I read, but I do get on these like sort of kicks of certain nonfiction topics and I will go kind of hard for them. So I ended up reading 15 comic books and manga, which actually all of those were in either Spanish or French, because basically I was reading the Volatile series in Spanish, or I was reading Death Note in French. So like that was kind of where that that split up. So I think it's probably like 2/3 French, 1/3 Spanish, something like that. So only 15 comic books and manga. I don't read as many comic books and manga as I used to, just because my library has a really like small selection of series I actually want to read, and in order to read the entire series, if you purchase it, it's really expensive and I can't do it. So unfortunately, that means that I just don't read as much anymore than I used to. Then the last one is how many nonfiction books I read. And this year I read 20 nonfiction books, which I didn't actually do my stats like this for last year, so I have no idea if I read more or fewer nonfiction books than I did last year. But I did read a fair number, although clearly my preference is for literature, fiction, etc. But I do read some nonfiction books, and I will say that this year, I kind of had a focus on females in the workplace, I guess you could kind of say. So I read Code Girls, I read I think Radium Girls, The Woman Who Smashed Codes, like a lot of sort of like World War II era and like codes and radiation. I don't know. So I also read a couple of books on like not fashion per se, but in line with clothing, because obviously I sew a lot of clothes, so that kind of makes sense. So I think I read Overdressed, I read The Constant Closet? No, that's not right. The Curated Closet, The Classic 10. I started reading Threads of History. I think that's the one. I have two different sewing and like fabric related books that I'm not actually finished with, but I started reading them. So I have kind of in that like textiles range of things. So I also did read two books as part of my anti-racism education. So I read White Fragility and Policing the Black Man. And I have several other books on my list to read for this year as well. I don't even remember. I read kind of a smattering, but I tend to have like 3 or 4 subject, like kind of themes or subject matter that I will read a few books out of each of those subject matters. And so that is kind of similar to what I did this year. You know, if you kind of go through all of my nonfiction books, they probably sort of like will sort themselves into smaller categories. Whereas wait, did I say fiction or nonfiction? My nonfiction books do that. My fiction books, it kind of depends. I tend to read a lot of like historical romance, historical mystery, some modern fiction, not as much modern fiction. Every once in a while I get into like a Victorian fiction kick or whatever. I kind of go through waves, but I don't really pay as much attention. Like my fiction reading, just I have certain types of stories that I like and I just gravitate towards that, whereas my nonfiction reading is definitely a cyclical thing where I'll get super intensely interested by one subject and I'll read like 5 or 6 books about that, and then I'll figure something else out and I'll like keep on going. So it's kind of the way that just works. So in terms of standout books for this year, I would say in the fiction side of things, I did a lot of rereading at the end of the year, so those are all just kind of like long-term favorite sort of things. I think one of my kind of long-awaited books was I finally read Wayward Son by Rainbow Rowell, which I really enjoyed and I'm looking forward to the 3rd book. I also read a book in French that I really enjoyed, and it was one that I picked up that was I think it was one that I got from like a buy 2 get 1 free sort of situation, and it just looked interesting. It was one of those that I was like, oh, I like the cover of this. And it was, what was the title of this one? It was La Librairie de la Place aux Herbes, and it was basically about this woman who used to be a French teacher in like Paris, and she retires and she and her husband moved to this small town, and like basically she ends up buying this bookstore and starts running it. And so each like chapter, each part of the book basically focuses on her relationship with a client who comes into the bookstore and like how they touch each other's lives. And I just really enjoyed that one. It was a pretty like short, quick read. I think it was only like maybe 200 pages or something like that, but I have such a soft spot for any novels that are about people who read, like obviously. I have a soft spot for that. So I really enjoyed reading that one. I also loved all of La Volatile books, but specifically I really enjoyed El Viaje because it was beautiful. It was such a good one. It's basically her and her friend go to Japan and they have this trip there, but she's also got like all of this sort of emotional and mental turmoil going on, and it's like traveling and like getting through this and like all of that. Like it was really beautiful. So I think those were probably some of the standout fiction books that I read. In terms of nonfiction, I think that You Need a Budget, I know. I really enjoyed You Need a Budget. I feel like I've kind of made some breakthroughs with thinking about my budget and like how I'm breaking down my budget and all of that this year, that I think reading the book actually really helped me. So I quite enjoyed that. And the other one, one of the other ones I read, A Year Between Friends, which, it's just like, it's gorgeous and the essays are so nice, and it really speaks to me because my best friend and I have always lived, I mean, since we were pretty young, we've lived like super, super far apart, and so that one was just like a really just like touching book. Like I really enjoyed that one. It's just like, it's a cozy one. I actually bought it so that I can flip through because it's, no, yes, this one. It's so pretty and it's just like so, it's so, anyway. Anyway, I know, very eloquent on that one. And I also really enjoyed the books that I read on like women in World War II and like, so the Radium Girls, Code Smashers. See, this is the problem. I can't pick a favorite book. Basically, if I finished a book, it means I liked it. It is very rare for me that I finish a book and go, oh my gosh, I 100% regret reading that. Like, it just doesn't happen. So I always feel kind of like, you know, it's like trying to pick a favorite child. Like, how do you pick a favorite child? I mean, maybe you do. I don't know. I know I have favorite students. Don't tell them. But you know, I have a really hard time picking favorite books because the books that I read, like, they suited the mentality that I was in at that time, or they suited like just what I needed, you know, if it was fiction, if it was nonfiction, everything I read served a purpose, you know, when I was reading it. And so everything that I read, I actually really liked. For example, I don't read a lot of short stories, but I read, I think it was an audiobook actually. I listened to a short stories collection called Drinking Coffee Elsewhere that was just like it was so good. And normally I don't like short stories that much, but that was one that I was like, okay, I'll give it a try, and I really enjoyed it. Like, I can't pick a favorite book. So yeah, those were a couple that I really enjoyed. I definitely had more. If you are interested, I do leave my Goodreads link down below. I never rate any of the books that I read. As I mentioned, I have a really hard time with that. If I finished it, it means I liked it well enough. Like, I liked it at least like a 3, 4, or 5 stars kind of level. But also I feel that reading is such a personal thing, and my way of deciding whether or not I like a book is only going to make sense to me. You know what I mean? I write a rating in my collection bullet journal when I do my tracker, and most of the time I literally, like, my standard ratings are loved it, fascinating, 3 little hearts, an exclamation point. Like, it's not a rating that anyone except for me is going to like get any meaning out of whatsoever. So on my Goodreads, I do track everything that I actually read, but I don't actually rate it. Like, you can assume if it actually made it on a finished thing, I probably liked it pretty well. I definitely had some, you know, I like this a bit more out of other ones, or like books that, like, a sign of a book that I really, really like is I reread it. So if there's a book on there that I've read multiple times, it means I really, really liked it. Obviously that doesn't really count for nonfiction, just because typically I don't reread nonfiction, but yeah. So that was why I decided to kind of change it up and not necessarily do like a list of the books I really liked, but rather just kind of go through the different stats and just like kind of chat about my reading challenge for this year, because I can't pick a favorite book. Like, it's not possible. I can't do it. So yeah, I'm really excited for my reading challenge for 2021. I have once again set 50 books just because I feel like 1 book a week is really respectable, and I know myself and I know I'll probably end up reading more, but like, if things get busy and I start doing something else, like, maybe I won't, who knows. So yeah, but on that note, I actually have already read, I think, 3 books this year. All of them are audiobooks because I am obsessed. So that is all for the book chat for right now. Let me know if you guys want some other book content. I'm not like a book YouTuber in any way, shape, or form, but I do read a lot. So if you're interested, let me know. And yeah, that is all I have for today. I will see you in my next video. Bye.
Hey guys, so if you've made it all the way to the end of this video and are actually watching my end screen and you're not subscribed to my channel, I would really appreciate it if you would. There's a little button right there for you to do it. And if you're interested in watching some more of my videos, I have links to 2 of my older videos off to the left there, so you can check those out if you would like to, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye!